Hello everyone and welcome to an extremely experimental potential new series that we're kind of test running today called the GameMaker Surgery. This is where we take the actual GameMaker project files from some of my Patreon supporters who are struggling with a particular issue that they've, some sort of mechanic they've been trying to get working for a really long time, something that they've made some reasonable effort to solve themselves, and they just aren't managing it and they want someone else to take a look, okay? I don't know if this is going to be useful. Maybe it'll provide insights into debugging or just like ways of structuring certain things. I don't know, but we're going to give it a test run and see how it goes and see if it's at all useful or interesting. So this first submission comes courtesy, thank you very much, Alejandro, or Indie Punch, for submitting this. We've got a game that's based largely on the action RPG, which is kind of helpful because that means I vaguely understand the structure of code without having to look too hard at it. And we've got a mechanic whereby we want to be able to push and pull a block. And you may have noticed the issue he's running into here is he wants it so you can only push and pull the block in one direction, which seems to kind of work left and right, although if I push up and down, I notice I'm pushing it to the left. But if I grab it from the top and I press up and down, that works, but if I press left and right, push it to the right. So we've got a few like just issues of confused like directions and stuff like that, which I think looking at the code is possibly something we could like debug and like solve like what exactly is causing the directional problem. But I think there's a structural issue at play here that would be easier to resolve basically by doing it in a different way. Let me just sort of show you what I mean. Let's just take a look at how this actually works. If I bring up scripts, go to the state machine for the player. So this is our player's free state, and we'll get a second column here and bring in player state push. And this is the push state that he goes into when he wants to actually move a block around. We didn't cover pushing or pulling blocks in the action RPG. It's not really built for it. It's actually a bit of a tricky thing to do sometimes if you haven't planned for it specifically from the get-go, which the action RPG did not. The reason for that is similar to the reason why it can be difficult to do like moving platforms in a platformer. If you haven't specifically planned for it, because you've got to, in an ideal world, you're doing two sets of collisions sort of simultaneously. The thing you're pushing and yourself. Like, it seems fairly straightforward. I'll just go into a push state and move both things at the same time. But collisions, always the issue, right? Funnily enough, the directional stuff is actually fairly straightforward. So it's usually the collisions that are more of a problem here. But here we've kind of got very confused over the directions, and that's partly because of how we are triggering this in the first place. So this is our free state, works very similar to the action RPG. We get our inputs, and then we already got our inputs in the step event, and then we're calling the free state, which is calculating our movement, doing our animation, colliding, and so on. And then we have all these different keys that we can press that might send us to different states, like attacking, grabbing, and activating things. Okay, grabbing is the one we're going to look at, and the way he's chosen to approach this is getting the position, checking for a collision with a pushable object, left, right, up, and down of the player all at once. Doesn't really make a lot of sense to do it this way, just because it doesn't take into account what direction you're facing. You would have thought this would want to work similarly to activating an object. So like you approach a thing, you press the button, and then you push and pull in that direction, right? Checking all around you has the disadvantage of like you're gonna push a thing you weren't necessarily facing towards, and also if the way you've done it like with a sequential if statements like this means if there's something below you that you want to push but there's also something to the left of you that you can push, you're going to prioritize the left thing even if you are facing towards the down thing, right? So the first thing we would want to do is, instead of doing it like this, we want to do it the way our activating signposts and things work, where we just find a position in front of the player and see if there's something there that we want to push or pull. And by doing that, we also don't need to do any of this like push direction enum nonsense, because we already know what direction we're facing. It's the direction we're facing, right? And we can either move forward or backwards in that direction, and it just makes things a little bit simpler. It's easy to fall into these kind of mistakes, and also like make things a little bit too complicated generally if you're not able to sort of envision the chain of logic that you need to happen. So sometimes when I want to solve a problem like this, if I'm starting from scratch and like, you know, none of this is here, and I want to like, all right, so I want to push and pull objects. How do I do that? I usually open Notepad, and I've done this ahead of time here, and what I will then do is simply work out exactly what it is I need to happen. Probably not going to get everything, and I'm probably not going to, like, there's going to be little exceptions and niggles, especially as the code gets more and more developed, and things I haven't thought of, and those are going to be the tricky things that are the problems as I go. But you try and think out as much of the problem holistically ahead of time, and then you're not sort of solving it like bit by bit like this and trying to work off of everything you've done along the way. Okay, hopefully if you work it out like this in a holistic way, the only problems you should run into are things you either didn't think of or things created by sort of earlier code that contradicts what you want to do. Okay, so this is all we need to do. We need to say, if we're pressing the grab button, we did that pretty straightforward. If there's something to grab it and enter the push state, and we can do this by checking in front of the player. Okay, so we don't need to do any of this, we just check in front of the player, see if there's a thing there, go into the push state. We already know the direction. All right. So in the player state, use the player's direction to inform which ways we can move. We just sort of do a simplified version of our movement, so it's just moving forward and backwards instead of 8 directions. Move the pushable object with the player, running collision on both. This is going to be the tricky part, because the action RPG is not really set up to handle simultaneous kind of collisions. The collision script for the player checks collisions and then snaps to the closest position to the thing and commits to the movement there and then. In an ideal world, you'd be able to sort of do a collision check for the player, a collision check for the box, and if they're both okay, then go ahead with the move. But that's a more complicated type of collision checking. We've kept things simple for the tutorial and so on, and it wasn't really built for doing this, but we can still make it work. And I'm going to show you how you can still make it work. Basically, what we'll need to do is the block that we're pushing and the player will need to make some exceptions for each other and sort of adjust each other so that they can move in tandem. It's possible. It's kind of a little bit messy, but it doesn't only in a trivial way, in my opinion. I think it'll work just fine. And then if we're no longer pressing the grab button, we exit the state. Okay. So first of all, I'm going to take the section of key grab here, and we're just going to get rid of all of that, and I'm going to replace it with a much smaller chunk of code that I wrote earlier. That looks something like this. Okay. Well, you're nice and big. In fact, we'll go back to single pane for now, just so we can focus on this. So key grab, all we're doing is we're going to use length direct and length y, just the same as we did for activating it, to find a position in front of the player. We use instance position again, and something about this game as well, just specific to this game. I know when your player sprite is starting to get this big, and your blocks are getting this big, it might be time to sort of move away from instance position, which I used in the action RPG, just simple point checks, because we work with a very low resolution, and using a point check was sufficient for very much all the collisions we want to do. It can start to look a bit weird when like half of you is inside like blocks and walls and things, because you're still just using the point. That is just a personal consideration. It does make things more complicated though, so I'll leave that to you. But anyway, we check that position. For parent push or pull, that just happens to be his particular parent object for pushing and pulling things. I've tried where I can with my code to sort of keep to the coding style that the Alejandro used. In fact, technically here I suppose I should be doing like grab X, grab Y, grab X, grab Y. He tends to use more of like an underscore system, although not consistently. I know in some places you've kind of used the style from my tutorials, some of it you've used underscores. I'm not really one to judge people for keeping their coding naming conventions consistent, but do try where you can. Makes things a lot easier for other people who if they do ever need to look at your code. But I'll try. I have tried where I can to keep to your conventions. Okay, so we check for that position, and if it exists, we assign you know, this is going to either equal no one or it's going to equal the thing we want to pull, and then we go to the state. Okay, much simpler, much smaller piece of code. And then let's get this back up. This is the player push state. We want to get rid of pretty much all of this. I don't really like. I could have tried to spend a while breaking down how it worked and be like, okay, where is it going wrong or whatever, but it seemed like systemically it was just a really awkward solution. So it's much quicker to just write it again from the ground up as a simple solution, rather than try and, like, you know, zero in on exactly where our directional stuff is going wrong. Okay, it might have just been a simple thing, but that simple thing could have taken a really long time to find, and it's just simpler to do it this way. So I'm going to get rid of pretty much all of this. We're keeping just the animation stuff here, but we're also going to get rid of this because we don't want to update our direction based on our inputs. In fact, that might have been part of what was going wrong before. So we'll get rid of that. Get rid of some of this white space. I notice you have a lot of white space just in your code, just a lot of, like, spaces between things. For me, it makes it slightly hard to read, but I'll try not to change things around too much. So keep that animation stuff the same. Yeah, that's all fine. Let's just bring it all together. Call it animate, just so it's just one little chunk that we know what it does and we don't have to think about it. Okay, that's our animation stuff. And exiting the state equals player.free. Yeah, that's what we want to do, but we also want to set grabbed to equal no one again, okay, because, you know, we want that entity, want that variable free for us to fill with the next thing that we want to grab. Okay, just a little bit of cleanup there. I'll paste in the rest of it at the top here. This is what we did. Okay, so two main sections, as you know, we decided from in here, right? We're calculating the movement that we want to move. We're calculating where we want to go based on our direction. And all I've done is said that if input direction is our current direction, or it's direction minus 180, so if it's in front or behind us, and or input direction equals direction plus 180, because direction numbers can wrap around in weird ways, you know. 350 degrees is the same as negative 10 degrees, you know, and if we're just taking direction and subtracting 180 from it, you know, that could go into minus, whereas this could contain a positive, whereas that could go over 360, whereas, you know, you get the idea. So rather than think about that for longer than 2 seconds, I've just checked both ways. All right, just, there's no harm in that. It's not going to kill, you know, your PC's not going to be mad at you for the extra check it has to do here. Just check the other direction. Just keep it simple, you know. Don't do too much brain work where you don't have to. Right? That's a lot of programming in my experience. Okay, so and that's we just calculate our x speed and y speed based on that. Just, you know, we're either going forwards or going backwards. Okay, we can just only go in. We can only apply speed if our direction matches. If the input direction matches forwards or backwards, okay? Then once we have that speed, we can go ahead and try and commit to the movement, all right? So we run player collision, as per usual. This looks pretty much identical to the ARPG collision stuff. You know, we check tiles, and we check entities, so on, right? Then the tricky thing is doing collision for the object we've grabbed. Now, what the solution Alejandro here went for is he actually made another collision check. He put it in the create event of player, I think. Yeah, down here. Move pushable. So he created this, like, blue function here, which is, again, almost the same. I can't remember the specific changes, but almost exactly the same. Basically, he copied and pasted the collision code for the player with just a few little changes here or there, just to make it specific to the box, so that, you know, it's not going to collide with itself, because the block itself is an object that can be collided with by the player, right? And so on. Just a few little changes, but there's such a small number of changes and they're so specific that I think in this case it's better off if we just call player collision again with the block, which is what I've done here. Because you'll notice most of this code is pretty agnostic in that it doesn't care who's calling it. It's still going to adjust the x and y. It's still going to use the x and y of whoever's calling it. It's still going to use the x speed and y speed of whoever's calling it. The only thing we're going to make sure is that the object that calls this has all of the blue local variables that it relies on. So collision map, x speed, y speed, and that's it. Okay, just going to make sure it has those. So that's what I've done here. We've gone with the thing we've grabbed. We've given it the collision map. We've given it an x speed and a y speed that are identical to the player. And then I'm going to store the position that we want to move to. Okay, and you'll see why in a second. And then we run player collision and we assign grab call to the result of player collision, because you'll remember we wrote in here, and this is one of the reasons why, because it's quite useful sometimes, at the bottom to return collision, which will be true or false if there was a collision. Okay, and then if there is a collision, what we can do, so if the box, when it has moved, has found a collision, in order to stop the player, the player's already done its movement, right? And this is the thing. Ideally, you'd want them both to happen simultaneously, but since we can't do that, we have to make some adjustments. So the player's done its movement, and like, you know, I don't know, maybe paint. I don't know how to visually do it, but like, the player is like here, and the player and the block it's pushing is here, right? Yeah, the fist will be the block, right? So the player has moved, like, and then the block needs to move. But say the block can't move. Well, the player has already moved. So if the block can move, but it can only move like to here by like 2 pixels or something like that, we need to then adjust the player back to where to the most movement it could have done, and that will be the difference between where it wants to, where the block wanted to move, and where it ended up being. Okay, so say it wanted to move to an x position of 105, it could only make it to x position 103. That's where it got snapped to when it ran player collision. If we take 105 minus 103, we get 2. If we subtract 2 from the x of the player, that means we adjust the player back so that the player no longer has moved too far. Okay, so we kind of like do a backup because since the player has already moved, they're already stuck inside something if the block can't move with it. So if that's the case, we just need to move them back, and that'll adjust for it just fine. Okay. Then the only other thing in here to make this work is in a grab call. Sorry, in the player collision check, when we check for our entities down here, we need to make an exception for the object that we've grabbed. Okay, not actually pasted this in anywhere, so I'm going to have to write it again, but that's fine. So if entity check.entity collision is true, but also entity underscore entity check.id does not equal grabbed. Okay, so when the player moves, since the block is a thing we can collide with, we need to make an exception to that so that the player can move and then the block can move, alright? Because otherwise the player will just never move because it'll try and move into the block, alright? It depends which way around you do it. Like if you move the block first, this would be different and so on, but you just have to pick one at the end of the day. Either move one first, do the other, and work the logic out from there. We've moved the player first, so we need to make an exception that says that we can move into the object that we've grabbed, because we're going to move the grabbed object afterwards anyway. Okay, and we need to put that on both axes here. Okay, so that's the horizontal check, and then the vertical check down here. Do that and there as well, just the exact same thing when we're going through the entities that we could collide with. And then you'll notice here when we do with grabbed, I've also set grabbed to equal ID for the grabbed object itself, which is a little hacky, but we also need to make sure that the object that we've grabbed doesn't collide with itself, because it's checking, in player collision we check parent entity for all the different things that can be collided with. That includes the block object itself, right? So we need to make an exception there. So I could have written another thing on the end here to be like, oh, make sure that, you know, and entity check.id doesn't equal ID, you know, or something like that. maybe that makes more sense. Maybe you want to do it that way. But instead, I've just decided that since we already have a variable that we can use for an exception, and it's not like the grabbed object is going to necessarily want to grab an object itself, right? We can just use the same variable, and then it's just lined up nicely so that the crate makes an exception for itself in the collision. Okay, that's a little, that might be a bit of like, it's a bit weird, a bit of a hacky one, but it's just, sometimes it doesn't really matter, and you got to commit one way or the other. Game design, game programming generally is like too iterative to spend forever worrying about these things. Sometimes you just got to make things work. So that's the way I've just decided to do that there. All right, and then I think the only thing left to do here is just make sure in the create event for the player we actually have that grabbed variable just somewhere, grabbed equal no one, just so that it's declared ahead of time. Yeah, I think looking at my script, that appears to be everything. So if I run the game now, what I'll do, moves around, or up to here, F, we can move left and right when we're facing it from the left, grab it from the top, move up and down, well, left and right. I'm pressing up and down, you just have to believe me, it doesn't do anything, and up, down, there, that's all fine, right? You'll notice one thing we can do though, is we can move it diagonally, right? Because, you know, it just takes the direction that we're moving. So if we move into it diagonally, we can push it. And if you don't want that, which fair enough, you might not, there's a very simple solution to that. In here where we do the key grab, all you have to do is just on the end of here stick and direction mod 90 equals 0, okay? Mod function's super useful like that. It basically means for the mod of something to be 0, that something would have to divide into the number perfectly, okay? So obviously 90 goes into 0 exactly 0 times, 90 goes into 90 one time exactly, 180 2 times exactly, and so on, right? Any number in between that, 45, whatever, is going to come back with a remainder, all right? So by doing that, that just means we can only do the grab stuff if we're facing one of those cardinal directions, okay? Left, right, up, or down. So I'll just run that again just to demonstrate. Let me push that left and right now, okay? Maybe the distance is a bit too much there. We did 12, maybe it should be less. I guess you can grab it from quite far away, but that's up to you. Anyway, that's how you do that. And if anyone else is wondering like how you can kind of retrofit the ARPG to allow pushing and pulling of blocks, there you go. You kind of know how to do it now. I don't know, was this useful? Maybe it was to Alejandro, I don't know. I don't know, I think I want you to watch the video, so I don't know I'm going to send the project files back to you directly. I want you to watch the video and see if you can make sense of it and get it working based on what I've shown you. But everyone else, is this kind of thing interesting? Is it like, you know, or is it too specific? Is it like, you know, we're getting into someone's specific project files and so on? Is it of any use to you at all? Let me know in the comments below. I don't know, this is extremely experimental. Don't know if we'll do a lot of these or if it'll become a regular thing or not, but it's something I thought might be interesting to try. I thought it might just show a different perspective and give some insight into the kind of debugging process and or the process just for writing certain things when you've just got to work out how do I use the knowledge I have to create stuff that isn't specifically described by a tutorial, like step by step how to do. I hope it was useful. Let me know in the comments below, and I'll catch you all next time. Thanks again to Alejandro for sending this in. See you guys.